As you said, it's about 700 quid for the standard version. So now instead of funneling your traffic to a third-party VM, you funnel it to the Azure Firewall instance. The advantage of the Azure Firewall, as opposed to a third-party virtual machine, is it runs as a service, which means that you don't have to worry about managing it as a VM. You don't have to worry about the load balancing, the scaling out, because it scales out automatically depending on the traffic. So that there's a lot of stuff that it will handle for you, which is all abstracted compared to running as virtual appliances. If you were to run it as a Sophos appliance, for instance, you'd have to deploy at least 2 of them. You'd have to deploy load balancers, and to make sure that obviously if one goes down, the other one is still running. You've got to manage how big they are, and you know how they're going to scale, all that kind of stuff. All of that is managed for you with Azure Firewall, and this would be a typical architecture for your Azure environment when you start using a appliance or the Azure Firewall. So basically, you've got your virtual network, but you've got a hub virtual network, which is it's just dedicated to the Azure Firewall, and then you've got your workloads running in spoke virtual networks. And the idea is, let's say you've got your domain controllers here. This might be a test and dev environment, and they might be peered through to the hub virtual network, and then you create your routes to say this VM can't speak directly to the internet. It goes through the peer and through the firewall. So any outbound traffic, whether it's to the internet, whether it's back on premises, it goes through the Azure Firewall, through the hub, and then you can monitor everything centrally from here. And
so from a design topology situation, if you were going to take that approach, you'd have to know that's pretty smartish before you started developing an environment. If you're going to do that, that would have to be, you have to have that design in your as your methodology straight away, so that everything else you built would fit in with it.
Not necessarily. So it's funny you asked. Actually, I'm actually working with another customer where they've deployed everything as you would typically, and now they're asking for this hub and spoke environment. I actually spoke to them. I spoke to them back in January 2020 before the pandemic struck, and I put this idea in their head, and then now they came 18 months later to say, look, we want to go forward. So they've got their existing virtual networks, and what I'm designing for them is a new hub, and then we will just change everything they've got to just peer through the hub now and retrospectively apply the routes, etc. So you can actually bolt it on afterwards. Obviously, if you start from scratch and design it, then it's easier. But you can bolt it on afterwards and just have some downtime whilst you configure everything. But yeah, this is the Microsoft. This is like a recommended topology to have the hub and spoke. So you've got the centralized hub here. You route traffic through, and the advantage of this environment is you can have isolated networks. So by default, these 2 networks can't speak to each other. So you could have like a test and dev. You could have production. They both go through the firewall, but then you can say, okay, I want this to speak to this now. Then that's when you create your route. Say, if you want to speak to this, then you go through here. So anything between
if we were to do our customer-facing websites now, and then do our server environment later on, we could then just do that as a separate isolated environment from the websites, so that they are, because they're different roles and completely different the way they behave. So you would treat them as separate environments, and then just do very, very limited rules just to allow the very basics that are required, if you like, between the 2 environments. Just lock it down.
That's kind of which is kind of what I'm doing for this other customer. They just want specific ports to be opened up for their customer. They've got a separate customer environment, which is going to be managed by a third party, but that third party needs access to certain resources on their internal network, like Active Directory, etc. So they want to route everything through the wall, and then they want to just open up specific ports as to what they can and can't speak to. So yeah, effectively that's what you can do. And also, if you've got a customer-facing environment and then you've got your own internal environment, you could actually put them in 2 different subscriptions. So you could have a subscription for your customer-facing stuff, and then you could have a different subscription for your own internal stuff. There's no harm to using multiple subscriptions, and it's actually, again, a Microsoft recommended framework to isolate your environments with different subscriptions. So even internally, you might have a production subscription and a test and dev subscription. And I think this is something I touched on with you last week, where I said it's part of the cloud adoption framework to have different subscriptions for different environments, and then you can then manage them all with a hierarchy, which I'll show you later. And again, these virtual networks can be in different subscriptions.
So you can do that. So they can be different subscriptions, but you can still have rules to allow stuff between them.
Yeah. So this customer that I'm working with now, I'm creating a new subscription. Well, I've recommended that they create a new subscription for the hub resources, and then these other spokes will be in different subscriptions, and then everything will go through this virtual network. But this will be in a different subscription on its own.
Okay.
And then, yeah, so your on-premises network will speak to your Azure environment. Again, it will go via here, but again, you can put a route here, routing all traffic from here through the firewall to get to the spokes.
Again, a lot to absorb. Yes.
It's these things called landing zones, and Microsoft has their own enterprise landing zone architecture, and this is part of that. I did have some documentation on it because, again, I was working for. So this is what I was showing the other customer. So let's go back. Right, it's here. Yeah, don't panic. Right, so this is one of the recommended architectures from Microsoft. This is the landing zone, but don't panic. Basically, you have what's called a management group. We're going to get into this, but these are your subscriptions here. You've got a subscription for management. So this is where you put your monitoring resources. So you mentioned monitoring the firewalls. You'd have that in its own subscription. You'd have identity. So that's where you put your domain controllers in this identity subscription. And you've got your connectivity. So this is what I've suggested for this customer, whereby this is where you'd put your hub resources. So you've got your Azure firewall, your express route, VPN, etc. That will go into the subscription. And then these landing zones are basically your production environments, where you'd put all your VMs and so on, or all of your web servers. They'd come from this landing zone, and that would be peered to the hub. But that would be in its own subscription. But you can have multiple subscriptions for different landing zones. You can have sandbox subscriptions for your test and dev environment, etc. But this is not something that you have to do. It's just something that Microsoft put forward as a
I noticed on that right-hand side, the DevOps. That's the bit that we were still trying to figure out how that gets linked back into ours later today. Yeah. On the right-hand side, DevOps. We obviously they've had DevOps set up, and how that would link in for if they're going to be then creating things in DevOps. How does that sort of link in to be able to? Because presumably, I think they can publish, can't they, in DevOps effectively? If they were going to say that they're going to publish to a server, I don't know whether DevOps allows them to create a server. Don't know too much about that.
Yeah, DevOps have their own pipelines in DevOps, and the pipelines allow for continuous integration, continuous delivery. So rather than deploying from the portal, they can have a pipeline just to deploy, let's say, into the sandbox, for instance, subscription, or whichever environment you tell it to. You can just have it deployed directly into there. But DevOps is something that wouldn't be covered in this workshop. We tend to work with a partner who specializes in DevOps because it's such a specialized area. But yeah, you could absolutely have infrastructure as code deploying your environment into
it relies on the same principles,
though,
doesn't it, as regards role based and things like that. So that if you were to say that there was a particular role that somebody in DevOps had, that from just a high level principle sort of situation, is that the type of thing that it would work?
Yeah, because they would need to have permissions to deploy whatever environment they're meant to be deploying in. So yeah, but you can apply your own policy definitions and your own role assignments via DevOps rather than via the portal. So anything you do in the portal, you could do via DevOps, via infrastructure as code.
Okay, which takes precedence then, Lord? If you were saying you were doing policies and roles and things in what we're looking at now, what we're creating now, does DevOps then honor those? So if you had the same, because at the moment they've got the DevOps bit and it's linked to our AD. So if we were to create roles within AD, would that then cascade to our Azure environment and the DevOps environment, so that the same roles and permissions are sort of global?
So I believe DevOps has its own separate roles, which can come from Azure AD, but you give it its own roles specific to DevOps. But if you create a permission on here, let's say you put a policy on here on this environment that says anything deployed in here has to be deployed from the UK, has to be in the UK. If someone tried to deploy something from DevOps into another Azure region, that wouldn't work because DevOps uses the same platform underneath. It has to adhere to the same policies as everyone else in Azure. It doesn't matter how you deploy it. The policy has to be adhered to, whether you deploy it from the portal, whether you deploy it from DevOps. If you've put a policy on the environment, it has to be adhered to, even if you're the owner.
So
you can't bypass
we created an environment that was, we'll call it test for
yeah.
want of a better term, and we created the policies in Azure AD to say only members of this role, which would be a certain AD group or whatever the case may be. Then in DevOps they would have to be members of that to be able to publish into that location.
Yeah, you'd give them that role
because of the fact that because it's all linked into the same as your AD, so it recognizes. Oh no, that's fine. That's the type of thing we're obviously trying to understand. What actual rules and things are still to be thrashed out in many respects, but the fact of the principle, if the principle is that if we create the role in the role actually so that it's associated with a group in Azure AD, if that'll then honor that for whatever we create in the environment, then that's perfect.
Yeah, we still got to thrash out who's going to be allowed to do what, I don't think, but that's for another day, I'm sure. Yeah. So I mean, up here you've got your identity and access management. So this is what you configure in Azure AD. So as I said, you've got things like MFA, privilege identity management, apps, DevOps, etc. All of that is managed from your identity access management in Azure AD. But yeah, as I said, this is just a framework, but it's something that a lot of customers now are looking towards as guidance for when they set things up. But yeah,
no, that's perfect, because we obviously we would create a test environment and we would create a live environment, but there would only be certain members that were part of a particular role that were allowed to publish to the test environment, and conversely, only other ones, higher level people, allowed to publish to the live environment.
Yeah,
that type of thing. So that would, from what you're saying, would then honor the Azure AD membership. So that's exactly what we're after. Yeah.
And then this is just a focus on the network environment. So the networking topology. So as I said, you've got the hub here in the connectivity subscription, and then you've got your other services peer into that.
I can see right in the middle as your key vault. That's for the certs and things, isn't it?
Yeah. So that's been created in your environments. Yeah, there's a key vault.
Is that just a separate entity? So whichever method we go, whether we use pass or whatever, that'll still just use the key vault. So if we get all of our certificates in there, it'll then just be able to pull out whatever's needed for the particular site we're publishing.
Yeah, you can store those things in the key vaults. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and also DevOps can also pull things out of the key vault as well, as long as it has permissions to do that. So as part of your pipeline, you could have, okay, get this connection string or get this certificate from the key vault, etc., etc.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, so that's, as I said, that's the hub spoke topology that a lot of customers move towards. Now, rather than you managing all of that separately, all of the routes, etc., Azure has what's called firewall manager and V1. So it creates the routing, etc., almost as a managed entity, but it's quite expensive. A lot of customers do it themselves, but V1 is pretty good if you just want to allow connectivity from, if you've got loads of Azure sites, then you could set up a V1 environment, and then rather than you creating the hub, Azure creates the hub for you. And then you just say, okay, I want you to peer these virtual networks, and it will peer everything to its virtualized hubs. And then you can just say, yep, routing for everything, and then everything can speak to everything with VBAN. And then you can go one step further and deploy Azure Firewall into these hubs, and then you can manage the Azure Firewall as you please.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, it's just abstracting and saving you having to manage everything yourself.
Yeah, as you said, though, it's potentially very expensive, and I would imagine that's high level stuff as opposed to at the moment we've got 14 or 16 websites of our phase one.
Yeah, it's probably not for you at the moment, to be honest. Okay, so if you want to secure connectivity between your services, so let's say you deploy an Azure SQL database, a PaaS SQL database, or let's say you deploy a storage account that your web servers need access to. By default, the PaaS services have public IP addresses and they're accessed over the internet. What you can do is create what's called a service endpoint. And what you do is you say, okay, this storage account can only be accessed from this virtual machine in this subnet. Oh, sorry, from this subnet, I should say. So if you've got a virtual machine running in that subnet, then yeah, it can access the storage account or it can access the database, etc., etc. But it can't be accessed from that public IP address on the internet. And you can whitelist your on-premises IP address for connectivity. So that's one way of securing access to your public services. And this also works for the web apps as well. If you access the web app, you can create what's called a service endpoint, and that's for traffic to the web app.
So that if we were doing the PaaS for our websites and using that for the web application services, then you would use the service endpoint to then. So if you were using the WAF, the application firewall, is that what you do? Because obviously it's going to create what you're saying is when you first do the service, it creates a public IP address as part of that creation. Is that right then?
Yeah, bear in mind this is for connectivity to the let's say this is a web app. So you'd probably have a WAF here. All of that inbound connectivity would come via the WAF, and then the WAF would be sitting in this subnet. Because when you deploy the WAF, it sits in a subnet, and then that could access the backend web app. So you could use it with a WAF for inbound traffic, or a more secure way of doing it is to use what's called the private endpoint. So with a private endpoint, it actually gives the PaaS service an IP address on the virtual network or in the subnet. What that means is, because with the service endpoint, although your VM is communicating with the PaaS offering, whether it's a web app or whatever, it's still using its public IP address.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then you're just blocking everything else and just allowing that. With the private endpoint, communication goes via the private IP address on the network. So it has its own IP address in your environment. And that means that if you need to access it from on-premises, that can flow via the virtual site-to-site VPN or whatever, and then to the service. Because with the service endpoint, you're still going over the internet, but all you're doing, you're whitelisting your public IP address for your on-premises environment. But with the private link, the private endpoint, it's a direct connection to that service. So again, that's another way of securing your environment. And something I was going to show you, actually, I had this lined up. Where did I put it? Oh, there it is. Right. So before lunch, you mentioned the WAF and the Azure firewall. Right. So this site goes through why you might use one as opposed to the other, or why you might use both. And it really depends on the traffic that you want to be filtering and whether it's inbound or outbound. And so the web application firewall is generally used for inbound traffic, and it's HTTP, HTTPS. The Azure firewall, it can be used for inbound, but it's typically used for outbound because it operates normally at the network layer. So this is a decision tree, etc., etc. So if you went for the Azure firewall only, HTTPS from the internet or on-prem to Azure, yes, but see below, because there are some caveats. And then outbound traffic is all okay. If you wanted to use TLS filtering as well, then you've got to go for the premium version. Right, so this is just using the Azure firewall. So traffic's coming in and out via the firewall. And as I said, you've got your route table. Anything outbound goes through the firewall's IP address. That's just using the Azure firewall. Right, application gateway only. Again, inbound traffic, yes. But everything else is no. And then this is your application gateway. So everything comes in. This could be a web app as long as it's got the VNet integration. But that's how it comes in and goes out. Then you've got them in parallel using both. So basically your inbound traffic, so this will be your websites, will come in, hit the application gateway. Your users would, well, hit the website or the web server and then head back out, as long as the traffic is going via the application gateway. But then any traffic out to the internet, so the source is the internal service, will go via the Azure firewall and then out and then back in. That's if they're in parallel, and that's if you need that level of protection for both inbound and outbound traffic.
Right, okay.
Now, if you just needed to whitelist your public IPs and make them static, then you could have the application gateway for inbound, and then any source traffic that's originating from here will go through the NAT gateway, and that would be a NAT gateway going out as opposed to the Azure firewall.
Yeah, it gets a bit.
Yes. Yeah. So I mean, some of this might be dictated by cost. Some of it will be dictated by requirements. Do you just need to filter the inbound web traffic?
That's an interesting question. I'm sure that's going to cause a few discussions.
Yeah, and then you've got this. I mean, this adds even more complication. This is using one in front of the other. So the application before the firewall. So all of your traffic goes through the application gateway, then hits the firewall, then goes internal, and the same for outgoing. But it tends to be the parallel as opposed to if you are going to use both, then it would be the parallel.
Yeah. Yeah, because what happens is the from a customer journey, the customer hits the website, and then At the moment, there's outbound stuff that would go down through the VPN to a server on-prem for using services on that one, for things like postcode lookups and all that sort of stuff, that when a customer comes onto the site to validate who they are, then at a certain point in the journey, it then goes off to do the actual pricing, and then that hits a third-party system where it goes outbound through the internet to our third-party provider. Well, then does validation and does the what's the API that they've got for CDL? There's ID3. No, I meant for the actual calculator. What do they call the CDL's gateway?
Sorry, say that again.
Yeah, I'm just chatting to Steve. There's our actual pricing system there's an external connectivity where it has to go off at a certain point during the customer journey when they're on the website to go off and hit an external system where it sends an XML feed and gets a response back to say it's going to be £50, £500, £5,000, whatever the case may be for your quote for your insurance. So so that's an outbound during that journey, outbound for the internet. So we just need to understand the journey and what the requirements are at each stage, because during that customer journey, they've got the customer coming into the website. At a stage, it will then go down through the VPN to validate some of the customer's credentials, and then when they go through and they fill all their details in, then it has to go to an external service to then come back with the price for the customer. So there's a few links into different places to allow these websites to work. I'm just trying to understand all the permutations and what that involves.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably best once you map it all out. So for instance, this would be your app service, hits the Azure virtual network, then you might have your on-premises. So this one needs to speak to that on premises, but then you might have, it needs to also go outbound. So you'd have a NAT gateway for the outbound traffic out to the internet, which would have your public IP addresses that need to be whitelisted for the outbound traffic. And then you'd have a application gateway here, that kind of thing.
Okay, so all right, okay, there's plenty to consider then on this setup.
Yeah, as I said, it depends on what you want to protect, what level of security you think you might need, how much you want to spend as well.
Protect everything for tuppence. That's what it is. That's the way it works, isn't it? That's the brief we get.
Yeah, there is a DDoS protection as well. So Azure has DDoS protection built in. You've got the basic version of DDoS protection, which protects everyone in the region. But then you've got the standard version where you can pay more for additional DDoS protection. Now with the free version, the basic version, what it does is it looks at the incoming traffic, and once the incoming traffic exceeds a mitigation threshold, it will then start channeling that into its DDoS protection, and only legitimate traffic will be allowed through. But with the free version, that mitigation level is based on the region, the average traffic for the Azure region. With the standard version, it looks at your individual traffic for each public IP address, and it sets that mitigation level dependent on your traffic. So it builds up a profile of your traffic. So it's more tuned to you, so that if there is a DDoS attack, there might be a DDoS attack that doesn't trigger the regional one, but it might just be more specific to you. But in actual fact, you're still suffering from a DDoS. Yeah, so it recognizes that it's more traffic typical for you, but not typical for the whole region. And that's where it will kick in at that lower level and then just send mitigated traffic to you. So that's the standard version. The downside is obviously there's a cost associated with the standard version, and it costs about, I hope you're seeing, it costs about just over £2,000 a month for the standard version. So you bear that in mind. Yeah. So most customers will say, oh yeah, I want DDoS protection, I want the highest level, and then you tell them the price, and they say, you know what, we're happy to take the risk of the free version.
Yes, yeah, sounds familiar. Yeah.
So that's it's there, and as long as you're aware of it. But yeah, that's available. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to breeze through these. So what I want to do is get you actually to create a VM. Go through that process. As I said, storage accounts, you create storage accounts, you get 3 copies in the primary region, you select regional replication or geo redundancy, and it creates another 3 copies in the remote region, secondary region. So if you have geo redundancy, you've got 6 copies of your data spread across 2 regions. You mentioned file servers. If you want to synchronize your file servers, and these file servers could be on premises, could be in Azure, you've got the Azure File Sync service, which is an improved version of DFS, I suppose you could call it, whereby you install an agent onto your file servers and you create an Azure file share, similar to what I showed you earlier for file storage. The agent will communicate with the file share, and you create what's called a sync group. So in that sync group, you can put all of the shares that need to stay in sync effectively. And what will happen is, as you make a change to any of your file servers, it will synchronize that change up to the Azure file share and then pull that down, or push that down, I should say, to the other file servers in that sync group. So the shares will all stay in sync, irrespective of where you access the file server from. And this file server could be in Azure as well. And then what you can do is create what's called cloud tiering, and you can say only keep the most recently used, 30% of data on my file servers. In which case the file servers will effectively become a cache. So the most used data will stay on the file servers. That will free up capacity on them, and then your file share in the cloud becomes almost your single source of truth. And it works pretty much the same way. You just, if there's something that you need accessed which is on here and not on the file server, it will just put it down in the background. And again, any changes will stay in sync, and then you can back up your file share directly from Azure backup on the cloud file share. So that's how that works.
Okay.
This is something that you mentioned earlier in terms of your resources. So you deploy them in your resource groups. They roll up into subscriptions, and then you can manage them with management groups. So this is why you might have multiple subscriptions, and then you can manage them at the higher level of the hierarchy in terms of management groups. And then if somebody needed access, if it was a test and dev person, you can just give them access to the test and dev subscription rather than the production environment instead. The reason why you might decide to separate out your prod from your test and dev is subscriptions have limits, and the limits are quite high, but you don't want to be in a position where someone has deployed so much in your test and dev environment that it affects the capacity of your production environment. So just be aware of that. That's one reason why customers might separate out that environment into different areas. And then, as you said, when you give people access, you can give them access at the resource group level. So rather than giving them access to the whole subscription, create your resources appropriately by application or by environment, and then just give people access to that level that they need at the resource group rather than at the whole subscription level. And that's called role-based access in Azure. And this is the diagram that I put together. So basically you decide where you want to give them access, whether really you shouldn't give someone access at the individual resource. You try and give them access at the resource group level, or at subscription, or at the management group. Give them that's the scope. You assign the person or the group. Ideally you want to use groups, but you can assign users or groups, and then you give them the actual role and that role will determine their permissions.
Just my understanding for the concepts then.
Yep.
We've done the networking in that subscription.
Mm-hmm.
Would we have to create separate networking if we were going to do a different subscription to then, say, isolate the test environment or whatever? Would that be a separate networking entity?
So if you were going, are we talking about the hub and spoke or just in, oh, actually, basically, if you have a virtual network has to live in a subscription. So if you've got 2 subscriptions, then you need at least 2 virtual networks.
Right.
You can't have a virtual network spanning.
We created, oh yeah, because that was the bit we created that primary network, didn't we?
Yeah.
That 10.166, whatever it was. So if we were to do another subscription, would we have to then create another primary network?
You would create another network for the resources in that other subscription. So whether it's test and dev or whatever. So if I go to your virtual networks.
Oh no, what I meant was it can't be a subnet of the existing subscription. We'd have to create a separate.
No. It would have to be its own virtual network. You can pair them together, so then you've got that shared communication between them. But yeah, if you created another subscription now for your test and dev environment, then yeah, you'd have to create another virtual network for those resources in your test and dev environment, which is not a huge thing. I mean, I can show you now how to create a virtual network. It's not a massive big deal, and then just pair them together.
Okay, yeah, it was a bit. I was just trying to understand as to if we were to try and do the isolation, because obviously you've got the VNet within that existing subscription where we could create different VNets for different things, or essentially you would create a whole new environment for the test and the like. Potentially, there's different ways of doing it, isn't it?
Yeah, and you don't have to put it in a separate subscription. That's just a recommendation. If you know your environment's going to be pretty small, then you might just say, look, let's just put everything into one subscription, and then that's good. You could even put everything into one VNet and just use subnets to separate everything out. Again, that's up to you. But ideally, you could try and put it into different VNets, and you can always pair them together, even if they're in different subscriptions. It depends on how big you think your environment's going to grow, and it depends on what level of isolation you want. And it's the level of isolation that should really drive things.
Yeah, okay. It's just trying to understand that. I mean, this initial stuff is meant to be for the website. So whether we would have the subscription for the websites, and then if we then did the on-prem stuff, starting to migrate stuff up to there, do a separate subscription for that one, just to separate out those, but then still be able to link for between for some of the services required.
Yes,
so,
I mean,
so if you did that, if you had different subscriptions and you could have one firewall and the VPN, you wouldn't need to recreate those. You would create a subscription and then link them back to the existing firewall and VPN.
Yeah, these three. This could be your web environment. Let's just say this could be your internal environment. These 3 virtual networks could be in 3 different subscriptions. This could be your subscription just for the hub, for the firewall, etc., etc., etc. And you could have your environment here, speaking to that for your on-premises. You could have this environment here for your web servers, peered to here. So if this needed access to anything on here, it has to go through this firewall, and you just create the appropriate rules for its level of access. But then these two don't have to communicate. If you don't want these two to communicate, they don't have to.
No, it was just potentially if we were to do the on-prem stuff, it just gives you a greater level of isolation, I guess, if you was under separate subscription and you locked it right down between the 2 environments just to the bare bones traffic that you needed.
Yeah, so that's a good point. Once you turn on a route and filter everything through the firewall, by default, the firewall blocks everything. So yeah, it's for you to then open up the traffic through the firewall and decide what speaks to what.
Right, okay.
unless you put a rule in place that just says everything can speak to everything, which is what the customer wants to do.
Okay.
Yeah,
as you say, everybody's got their own choices.
Yeah, which kind of defeats the purpose of having the firewall. But they say, look, we'll tighten everything up afterwards. We just want everything to speak to everything first of all, and then we'll. But that's up to them. This is a design I did for another customer. Basically, this just shows how you'd have different subscriptions rolling up to the management groups, and then you'd have the hierarchy there. And the reason why you'd have the subscriptions running up to, you'd have production subscription rolling up to a production management group, which then rolls up to here, is, let's say you wanted to add a second production subscription, you could just add that to this management group here, and any security that you'd applied here, any policies, would just be inherited by that subscription that you add to
this presentation that you're showing us now. Do we get a copy of this?
I can send you a copy. Just be aware.
No, because I was just looking at the hierarchy there, trying to explain to people what the possibilities are. That sort of diagram is quite, especially for like the test, dev, prod, just them understanding the concepts.
Yeah. Just be aware this isn't the official Softcat.
No.
It's just something I knocked together. But yeah, absolutely, I can send this out. Yeah. So let's say you've got this dev environment here. Then you could just add your admins at this level, your administrators, and then any new subscriptions you create for dev, they would have access to as well. So that's one way of separating things out. And then when you want to be more granular, just give people access to the actual resource group. So like third parties that come in and need to work on the environment, they can just have access to the group. And then you put your networking services here so that your internal network guys have access to this subscription. And this could be your hub connectivity, etc., or your monitoring as well.
Yes, because that would be an interesting one in it for third parties. If we've got this consultancy company that are going to be doing work on the environment, is how we would give them access if they're not members of our Azure AD currently.
Same way you gave me access. Oh no, you didn't, did you? You sent it to the
support team.
That's right. Okay, I'll show you that. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, this is the same thing, but just with policies. So you assign policies. So you can say a policy at the top here. You've got to deploy within the UK, and then that would just filter down to everything else. And then you can have more specific policies on the environment. So you can say policies here. You can only deploy, or policies here. You can only deploy small VMs. Maybe here medium VMs, and here you can deploy whatever you want. But here you can have policies that are more restrictive in terms of security. So you can't deploy VMs with public IP addresses. Could be a policy on here, and that would filter down to anything in the production environment. So that's how you can have your hierarchy and manage the environment.
Okay. Yeah, because we may say that this company that's doing the work can only work in the test environment and produce all the stuff, where it'd be down to us to then make it go live. Just that type of thing, I guess.
Yes. So let's say, hold on. Right, this is my lab environment, and let's say I want to give you access to, let's see what resource groups I've got. I need to be careful here. So these are my resource groups, and I think I've got a VM in here.
VM1, yeah.
Yeah, so let's say I wanted to give you access to this. Let's say this was an application, and I say you can work on this application. I would go to access control, which is here, and all of your resources, all of your resource groups, everything has this access control here. And I would go to these are my existing role assignments. So you'll see that, yeah, there's me. And my Softcat is a guest, and I could add you. So if I added a role assignment, right, so where it says select role, this is the important bit. So these roles will determine what permissions you have at this scope. And these three at the top are always present for everything. So these are the most commonly used ones. So owner is basically you can do pretty much everything in the environment. Contributor is similar to owner, but you can't manage permissions. So where a third party wants to deploy their own application, you might give them contributor, so they can do whatever they want, but then they can't manage permissions, so they can't add other,
that makes
other
sense,
people.
yeah.
And then reader, as the name suggests, is read only. So let's say I wanted to give you reader access to my environment. I would select the principal. So I'm going to select the user group, and it's going to ask me for the name. Let me just grab my, see if I can find you. Oh, do me a favor, just ping your email address into the chat.
We'll just do it's david.green.
Okay. David.green
at Europa, EUROPA -group.co.uk.
Right, so obviously you're not in my Azure AD, but you're a guest. So if I say save that, okay, so you should get an email inviting you to my environment. And if I just show you the one I got from your environment when the guys added me to your environment, which was here. So this is what I got. That's what I got from your environment when the guys in the support added me to you, and then I just click on accept invitation. So if you accept the invitation,
I clicked on accept.
And then what I should see, if I go to my Azure AD, I should see you in here as a guest. Oh, there you are. So you're a guest now in my Azure AD.
Now, in your Azure AD, does your Azure AD need to be configured to allow guests?
No. This is just all part of the Azure AD functionality.
Right, okay. No, because I thought that by default, the guests were blocked.
No, I didn't change anything. I've allowed you as a guest to my Azure AD.
Yeah, I can see.
Creation type was by invitation. So that means now that you should have, if you go to the portal, oh, and that's one thing I have not shown you, the run through of the portal. So from the Azure portal, if I go to the home page, this is what you should see when you log in, something similar to this. Obviously, this is my lab environment. On the left-hand side, you've got your shortcuts. You'll just have the default ones that you get, but you can add and remove stuff from here. You can reorganize them as you want, depending on what you use. Across here is the search, and I actually find this more useful than this actually. In my other lab environments, my favorites were so long, it was just quicker to search in here. So from here, if I go to VMs, I could just jump straight to my virtual machines. If I wanted to look at my public IP addresses, I could just jump straight to here. You can just start typing, and it also keeps your recently accessed stuff. So it just makes it nice and easy. So I could jump back to Azure AD. So that gets more use for me compared to the shortcuts. From here, if you wanted to, you mentioned just mentioned your love of PowerShell. From here, you can run PowerShell commands directly from the console. So if I jump into this one, this is already configured. The first time you access it, it will look to create a storage account for you. What you don't want to do is go with the default. Let's just go back here. So you can use bash. So bash is the Azure CLI. So it's the command line specifically for Azure, or you've got PowerShell. Oh, just come off that. Do it again. Gosh. Right. And if I go to PowerShell, so what it wants me to do is, it says I've got no storage mounted. It wants to create a storage account, because what it does, in the background, it creates a little container for you, almost like a home directory. So whenever you log onto the portal, you'll always have access to that little container. If I go to show advanced, because it will try and create it in whatever default region it shows there. But I can tell it, I can create it in advance. I can tell it to create new or use an existing. Just tell it to, I don't know what's in there, just use that. So put it in that resource group, create a new storage account, and file share. I don't have one, so I just say test01 file share. And it doesn't like that. What doesn't it like?
Nothing in storage account in the middle. Got required field. You haven't given it a name.
There you go. There you go. There you go. And again, this has to be globally unique. So I'll just say.
Okay. Now it's done the button now.
Great. So if I say, yeah, create storage, and then in the background, it will just go off and create that little container for me. This was actually one of my Microsoft exams as well. So I should actually know this.
Last time I did a Microsoft exam was 1999.
NT4, was it? MCSE?
Yeah.
I remember that. Showing your age there, David. Right, whilst that's creating, I'll jump onto my other lab environment, which is this one. This is my MSDN. So I've already got this created. So I can choose between PowerShell or the Bash. And it doesn't matter where I log on, this will always be here. And then from here, I could run any commands, any PowerShell commands, etc. And I've got a home directory. I could do a ls. I could store certain scripts in here if I wanted to access them quickly. The advantage of running commands from here, as opposed to installing PowerShell on your laptop and so on, is you don't have to authenticate if you run it from here because you've already authenticated through the portal. Whereas if you run it from your laptop or whatever, you've got to go through the authentication process to access the Azure environment. So that's what that button is for. Right, so this button is what you will need to change the directory. So I've given you reader access to my environment. From here, you can see what your different directories are that you have access to. So this is just a demo one. If I look at my Softcat one, and I need to be careful here, is this being recorded?
It is.
Oh, okay.
Need to stop recording for a second, Errol. We can while you do this if you want to. It's fine.
Yeah, please.